Great. Welcome back to PLMW for the afternoon sessions. We will start off with a panel featuring I guess, 6 esteemed researchers, and then we will have more talks in the next session. I want to kind of emphasize again, if you did not see this before, that we are taking questions online. So it's very easy to use. You don't have to sign up for anything. Just go to slido.com, enter in the event code, which is hashtag POPL2020. Make sure you select PLMW from the drop-down menu, otherwise your questions won't go to the right room. And then just type your question, and then I will try to moderate live and ask questions as they come up. Okay. So I want to briefly introduce all of our panelists. So the first one is William Bowman. This is all about William. Our next panelist is Kenny Foner, who's sitting right here, roughly going from here to here. Third panelist is Juliana Franco from Microsoft Research. Next panelist is Anna from Vassar College. Fifth panelist is Andrew Hirsch, who is a postdoc at Max Planck Institute. And finally, we have Taro Sekiyama from National Institute of Informatics in Tokyo. Okay. So I'll kind of stand here, I suppose. So thanks again for all of you for agreeing to serve on this panel. I was wondering, maybe a good way to start off after this very quick introduction is to go kind of down the line and kind of just say a bit about yourself and how you got into your research area and general experience.
Sure. So I'm William. I got into my research area. Basically, I was doing my undergraduate at Indiana University in computer science, and I took a programming languages course, and I had no interest in math or programming languages until that course, and I just sort of got fascinated by it. And then I took a compilers course and was even more fascinated. And I was applying for some job or other, and I asked one of my professors to write me a recommendation letter, and they assumed that I was applying to grad school. They said, "Oh, where are you applying?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm not going to grad school. I don't want to do a PhD. I can't imagine writing a dissertation." And this is Dan Friedman, and he said, "Oh, that's disappointing. You should go work with Amal Ahmed, who was at IU at the time." And I pretty much ignored him for a little while, and then I was working my internship, and I was kind of bored, and I started reading about programming languages, and I thought to myself, well, if I'm doing this in my free time and when I'm avoiding work, maybe I should go do this for real. So I went and I talked to Amal, and she gave me a research problem, and eventually I solved it, and I just sort of kept doing this. And I kept telling myself, well, I don't know if I'm really down to do this, but I guess I'll keep doing it as long as I'm having fun and enjoying myself. And so far that hasn't stopped, so I just keep doing it. And that's how I ended up here.
So hi, I'm Kenny. I guess I tried to make my intro slide as symbolic and large fonted as I could. So my start, I guess, in PL was I got to Brandeis as an undergrad, and I had no idea what I wanted to do. I thought maybe I would do philosophy or math or creative writing. Turns out I ended up doing a bunch of those things in undergrad because yay, liberal arts universities. So at some point I took an intro to programming course that I was not very interested in because it just didn't pique my fancy. And then I said, well, I might still be interested in programming. Let me look through the course roster and see what else there is out there. And I came across this interesting course called The Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs with my to-be future undergraduate advisor, Harry Marison. And I took the course and sort of fell in love with Scheme and kept doing that, and it kept being fun, which I guess led me to the PhD program at Penn and now to working at Galois, where I still get to do a bunch of cool functional programming stuff. And I think it's funny because people sometimes come up to me and And their impression of what we do at Galois is that we do verification, and that's true. But I still don't think of myself as like a verification person. Like at my heart, I feel like I'm a functional programmer. I love like writing cool programs, and right now I'm writing cool programs that are about verification. But that's sort of like the arc that's always been in my path, I guess.
Hey everyone. So yeah, that's me. It's a good question of, it's a nice question how I got here. So basically 7 years ago or so, came across this paper on session types, and I was working on it for my master thesis, and I thought that type systems were awesome. I was completely in love with the subject, and I decided that I wanted to do a PhD on it. So applied for a PhD at Imperial College, started working on behavioral types and ownership types, and then sometime 1 year later after I started, I decided that I wanted to learn something new, and I changed topics to memory management, which I fell in love with too. So, and then after I was working in memory management, I thought it was really cool, but I still wanted to learn more about lower level stuff. And I wanted to know how was life outside academia, so I decided to do internships. And while I was an intern, I was working in compilers. So I was like, okay, compilers is really cool too, so I want to learn more about it. And here I am now. I work at Microsoft. I'm working in compilers for AI, because I also want to learn about AI. I think that will be the next thing I'll fall in love with. So yeah, so that's me.
Hi, I'm Anna. So I got into programming languages research similarly as William. I took a class in undergrad on programming languages that was interesting. And I tried to do some research in programming languages as an undergrad, and it went terribly. It was just did not work. And I was now a junior in college, and I was like, well, I'm off doing an internship in the summer. That's really fun. So should I go to work or should I go to grad school? Now, at this point, it was like the start of my senior year. And, I asked my parents for advice. And my dad said, well, if you're not sure, why don't you go work for a bit? And if you like it, then that's clearly the right place. And if you don't, you'll know why you want to go back to grad school. And that's what I did. So I went and worked at Microsoft for a year after college. And I realized that I really missed research, because I had to write a senior thesis as part of my program in CS and math. So I realized I missed research. I also really missed TAing that I'd done a lot of. So I applied to grad school, and I ended up at Carnegie Mellon, where I worked with Frank Fenning and Lim and Gia, which was amazing. I specialize in formal methods, so type systems and logical systems, in order to prove security properties. And I finished my PhD this past summer, and I'm now a first-year faculty member at Vassar College, where I do a lot of teaching and some research as well.
Hi, I'm Andrew. So, like several members of this panel, I started with classes. So, first year of college, I was lucky enough to take 2 classes that really changed things for me. One was a class in linear algebra, of all things, which just introduced me to proof-based mathematics and took me from really hating math to really loving math. And I ended up declaring a math major, as well as a CS major, surprising myself as much as anybody. The other one was a class in functional programming, which was mostly in Scheme and didn't really catch my interest, but we did about 2 weeks in Haskell. And I couldn't get that out of my head. And I really kept wanting to push on that. And eventually, my undergraduate, George Washington, hired somebody who did programming languages stuff, and he did programming languages in security. And I worked on that with him, and I really loved it. But when I went to grad school, I wanted to push forward and do more theoretical stuff. And I got to do that, and I got to work on cool category theory stuff and effects. And the whole time I kept going, but there are applications of this to security. So yeah, when I graduated and near the end of my grad school, I decided I wanted to go back to thinking about how these things work on security. And that's where I am now. And, now working in the Foundations of Computer Security group at Max Planck, and getting to do what I love. It's great.
Hi, I'm Itaro. And the origin of my research is in the Bible text types and programming language written by Benjamin C. Pierce. And before reading that book, I was very unfamiliar with the theory of programming. Yeah, of course, I love the programming, but I'm not familiar with the theory of it. But yeah, and but that book gives. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you. And but that book gives me a very finding that programming is connected with a very beautiful and cool theory related to the mathematics and the logics. So yeah, that's why I'm here.
Okay. Thanks a lot. If there's any questions at any time, just raise your hand and I'll try to give you this microphone. I wanted to ask a little bit more about, I guess, just the grad school experience and what things were like. So maybe to start things off, people often say that, your advisor or your advisors, if you have multiple of them in grad school, are very important towards, your experience in grad school. And I was wondering if you could say a bit about, how did you meet your advisor, or were you deciding between different advisors, or how did you kind of manage that relationship?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, I met my advisor because one of my professors told me I should go work with her. And so I just went and introduced myself and asked if she had research to work on, and she gave me some problems. That was senior year of undergrad. So after that, and I actually decided I wanted to go to grad school, I started looking at different grad schools that had people working in the areas I was interested in. So I went and I looked at professors' pages and looked at what their research areas were, and looked at the projects and thought, well, what of these are most like the project I'm currently working on and interested in? And I ended up with two acceptances to grad schools. And the way I made that decision was I basically thought, okay, well, I know basically what I'll be doing with them all, and I have some idea of what I'll be doing if I go to this other school. And I primarily picked based on how interested I was in the projects that I thought I'd be working on. So that's sort of how I went about picking my advisor, and I never ended up changing because I was quite happy with what I was working on and with our working relationship. My advisor always gave me a lot of freedom to work in my own way, and quite a lot of freedom to tinker with other things that are only finally going anywhere. And that was really the right working relationship for me. And I know a lot of people, some people want more structure than that, so it's sort of important to think about what you need from your advisor and what kinds of projects you'll be working on when you're making that decision.
I think when I was an undergrad at Brandeis, I was lucky enough to go to ICFP when it was in Gothenburg, in Sweden, and I suspect that the reason for this is that there were very few undergrads at Brandeis who were asking for funding to attend conferences in computer science, and so Harry was like, well, this funding isn't really going anywhere else, so why not? So I lucked out in that way, and I was in Sweden, and I was socializing with all sorts of people, and I ran across Richard Eisenberg, and he's sort of a prolific Haskeller, and I was talking to him about how awesome I thought Haskell was, and he was like, you should come to Penn, in this very particularly emphatic way, and introduced me to his advisor, Stephanie Wyrick, who then became my advisor when I did actually come to Penn a year or so after that. Yeah, and that working relationship worked out really well. I think Stephanie gave me a lot of, like you were saying, a lot of freedom to explore things, and one of the most successful projects that I ended up working on ended up sort of coming out of left field and not quite being about the research area that I thought I would be working on with Stephanie, but it was a really sort of exciting thing to sometime in my third year say, hey, this is like a thing that I'm really excited about. I want to push this forward, and that at that moment, I guess, like it seems like I've heard from a lot of people, there's this moment in your graduate studies when you get to say that, and your advisor says, all right, let's try to do that thing, and that became this thing about random testing that was not to do with the type theory that Stephanie was working on at the time, but was a lot of fun.
Yeah, so I think I met Nobuko Yoshida here a few years ago when I was a master's student, and she told me about this project that she had with Sofia Drosopoulou, and that they were looking for PhD students. And back then I looked at the call for applicants, and it looked super interesting. I looked at the papers of both of them and of the whole team. I was really interested, and the work looked really nice work, like very good quality. So I decided to apply for it. Back then I remember thinking that I would not get it, but I went for it anyway. And then, so I got accepted to the PhD, and both of them were are in very good research groups. So I got along well with both of them. And then the project itself was also very good because I had the opportunity to collaborate with many people in different institutions. So I think I got a bit lucky. I think for meeting Nobuko at the right time, I guess. But then once I started doing my PhD, I was working in ownership types and session types, as I said before. That was working very well. And then at some point, I decided to change topic. And I think that was a very important moment in my PhD. So from that moment, I started working a lot with Sofia on a completely new topic for me. And I was also collaborating with Tobias Rikstad from Uppsala University. So, and I think I was very lucky, not just with my supervisors, but also with the people I collaborated, because I just felt I was learning every week. I was learning a lot of new stuff. Also, another reason why I was so lucky was because when I started my PhD, I said I have zero background in formal methods, and I really want to learn more about it. And my supervisor actually took the time and the energy to sit with me many hours, teaching me everything I needed to teach and iterating on my drafts and on my formalisms over and over and over again until I got to a point where I could do it on my own. So yeah, there was no reason to change. It was a very good collaboration there.
So my advisors actually found me, so that worked out really well. So what happened was I'd applied to CMU, but at CMU you apply to the program overall and you just indicate an area. You don't apply to a specific advisor. And I got an email from Frank Fenning saying like, so I saw your application and I have this grant in collaboration with some other people and we're looking for a student, and I think based on the work you did before might be a fit. And like magic, it was a fit. And I ended up starting to work on that project for a few years and then doing another related project. It was really important to me, though, to find an advisor who was pretty hands-on and who had time for me, because I had learned, based on my experience in undergrad, that I'm not someone who does terribly well completely left to my own devices. I kind of turn into a sloth. Like, I get a lot out of meetings, out of deadlines, out of collaborating. So I told Frank that when we were talking about working together, I was like, look, like I'm really interested in this project, but I'm wondering like how much time do you have to meet with me and stuff like that? Because I think I needed an advisor who's hands-on. And it turned out to work out fine. Like I met with him and Limon, Gia, my other co-advisor, like on the average of probably like twice a week, once a week, and that ended up working out well. But when you're looking for an advisor, if you have something that you think is necessary for you to do good work, like it's in everyone's best interest that you mention it. Like for example, I also knew I wanted to do a lot of teaching, like more than that what was required by the program, and I brought that up early and that was fine.
So yeah, I went to Cornell partially because there were multiple people there that I was interested in potentially working with, none of whom were the person I ended up actually working with. But as I was trying to work with some of the more senior faculty there, I felt like I wasn't getting the structure I needed. And my advisor, who was a brand new professor, kept coming up to me and being like, hey, want to work on this project? How about this one? And eventually, yeah, we ended up working together, and it worked out really well for several years. Towards the end of my PhD, it was pretty obvious we were going in pretty different directions, and I think that put a lot of strain on our relationship, which, I mean, it worked out well. I graduated, he and I still get along, but it was to kind of touch and go there for a little bit, sadly.
Okay, so I think one of the important things to build a good relationship with a supervisor is that students work actively and ask many questions to supervisor and have many discussion times with the supervisors. So for example, when I found an interesting paper, I came up with many extension ideas and many questions, but sometimes there seems to be stupid for our expert. But my supervisor, gave me many comments why this is not, my idea is not so good, and why the possible extension direction is this, like that. And so I think your supervisor also should do the same thing. And so the important thing is to you work actively and you ask many questions and you have many discussion times with supervisor. Yeah.
Okay, great. So there's many other topics that people are asking about in Slido, but I want to quickly ask one more question about advisors. So for people who are advised by more than one advisor, there's a question about how do you manage to efficiently balance between the two of them or synchronize between them. I had two advisors myself also, and I felt it was not much of an issue for me. I guess I was fortunate, but I'm wondering if people who had two advisors, what they think about this.
So two advisors worked really well for me because we were working on the same project. And that sounds kind of obvious, but so I was the ombudsperson for the PhD program at CMU, so I've seen a lot of advisor situations go wrong when students would come to me for help. And with co-advisors, the danger is that it ends up with two little separate projects, and people aren't really meeting in the same room and communicating. So for my co-advising relationship, we work on the same project, and we have a weekly meeting, all three of us. And then I would meet more with one or the other, depending on who had more time and what specifically I was doing. You don't want to end up in a situation where you're kind of like the go-between between two professors, and you've got to keep telling them what the other one said, and that just doesn't work out. So you want to make sure that your co-advisors genuinely want to work together on the same project, not that they both want to do a separate project that's wholly kind of vaguely related.
Okay. So,
No, so I'll speak just like that. So yeah, it's what you're saying. It's much easier if it's just a single project. I mean, in the end, it is your PhD project, not the PhD project of your supervisors. So for me, it was very easy because it was a specific topic. And I think that what I tried to do, or my strategy was, I was working more hours with one of my supervisors, but I always tried to keep the other one up to date and understood about what I was working on. So yeah, and I kept on going to the meetings of both my supervisors because that was very good for me as well to see what my colleagues were working on. But yeah, that's pretty much the strategy.
okay, I guess other people don't have two advisors. So moving on a bit past, there are many questions about just the research process, specifically dealing with negative results or periods where you're not really feeling like you're making much progress. So maybe I can broaden that a bit and say that a lot of grad school is marked by a lot of highs and lows. You're maybe very happy for certain periods and maybe substantially less happy at other points. So could you talk a bit about some of the highs and or lows during your grad school and how you kind of managed to go through the lows?
Testing. Yep. It works. Excellent. So I'm going to be talking about that in much greater detail later at my talk about mental health in grad school, or lack thereof. And for me in particular, the structure of grad school made it difficult for me to balance my own like highs and lows. The way that the sort of long arc of deadlines happened made it such that I was able to sort of coast for a long time, and then when a crunch time would happen, I would sacrifice a lot of my personal health and just try to meet the deadline at the last minute. So I think the truth of it, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, statistically we know for a lot of people, is that it's difficult to maintain a kind of like even-keeled stability within grad school. And I think a lot of this is due to the structural constraints or the sort of like long arc pacing. Like when you're working on a research project, oftentimes you won't know what the results are going to be for this thing that you're trying to push through, and then finally, like maybe 3 months later, you find out that the proof doesn't work and you need to rework it entirely. Or I remember talking to a colleague of mine who found out after a year of trying that there was some soundness flaw in the type system that she had been developing, which is like really crushing. And can be really difficult because it feels like you're not sure when you should be putting in how much effort. And there's more to say about that, but I'll save the rest of that for my talk later.
Yeah, looking forward for this talk actually. So I think that the lowest points in my PhD was when after 6 paper submissions, all of them were rejected, 5 or 6. It was very, very tough to see paper rejection after paper rejection. And, you know, like whenever I was submitting a paper, I always felt really proud of the paper. I thought, okay, it's very easy to read. It's very pretty. I really like the work. It's going to be accepted this time. And then the reviews came and they were worse than the last time. So that's not easy. But the good thing about it is that eventually the papers do get accepted. And the even better thing about it is that the version that it's accepted, it's much better than the ones that were rejected, and you liked it much better. But one of the lessons I learned from all these paper rejections is that the way you communicate your work and the way you write papers you write your papers, it's really, really important. So for me, it really, or what made the difference was I started speaking about my work with people I would meet in conferences. And I started asking for feedback, so I would give them the drafts. I did not do this with many people, just 2 or 3 professors. I would give them the drafts, and they would tell me, or they would give me suggestions on how to improve my work and how to communicate it in more effective ways. So that was one of the lessons, and the other one is that it's very important to criticize your work and to have some self-criticism. So if you have a paper rejected, look at it and see what you did wrong and try to see, or try to think of something to improve on your own other than just do what the reviewers said.
So there's a nice graphic that I've seen that I think someone made at CMU that kind of models a PhD as a roller coaster and kind of marks the highs and the lows. And you know, there are lows kind of, so I guess like a high is getting your like first paper accepted. A low is in programs that have like qualifying exams that you're really stressed about. So there's also a low that gets, so in programs where you have to propose your thesis, so usually this is after you've done a project, you've had a paper or 2 accepted, and you're proposing like what are you going to do before you defend? Like what is your thesis actually going to be? So a lot of people go through somewhat of a low there. As evidenced by the roller coaster graphic. And I totally did as well, because it was the kind of thing where I'd finished a project and I needed to choose like what related thing I was going to do next. And I was trying a bunch of things, and I mostly do proofs. So like someone said, is you can spend months, and then it turns out that like you've proved something and it's trivial and useless. I actually have a list of things that I've proved that turned out to be trivial. Or oops, it's false in one of your 50 cases, and it's always the last one. Fail, always. Doesn't matter where you start. I've tried to game this, like, fails. And, you know, just flailing around, like, trying to find the next thing, and that was, you know, kind of just annoying and not very fun. But then finally, something did work, and I found the next piece, and I proposed my thesis, and I was like, yes, I've proposed a thesis, and then I was like, wait, now I actually have to do the things, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I, like most of the people on this panel, have been through all of these ups and downs. But I think one of the most amazing things I ever did for myself in helping me get through them is something that maybe has a little bit of stigma, but really shouldn't, which is I got a therapist. I actually got a therapist for completely different reasons. I got a therapist because I had family issues going on. But when those got resolved, what was left unresolved, obviously, was work stuff and going through highs and lows. And just having somebody on my side who was there to tell me, you know, here's where you can do something to improve your part of this, turned out to be one of the most amazing, helpful things for my sanity, literally. I think there could have been.
Okay, and for me, the negative result is not failure. So I mean, for example, so if we got a paper rejection, then but it is a second successful result. Of course, the paper acceptance is the most successful, but the paper rejection, we get feedbacks from reviewers, and we have a chance to improve papers. And as for experimental negative result is similar. We can improve our approach, and we can improve the experimental setting, and which leads to the success to the paper acceptance. Yeah. So my comment is that negative result is not failure. It's a key to the success. Yeah.
Great. William?
Yeah, so this is a hard question for me to answer because and it might actually might put some people off, but the way I deal with the highs and lows of grad school is that I love my work, but to me, my work, my PhD, my professorship, this is all completely secondary to me in my life. So what is most important to me, and it's sort of related to what Andrew says, is sort of my own well-being in my own life and my own personal happiness. I don't care about my job more than I care about myself. And so to me, if a paper gets rejected, it's annoying, it's frustrating, but I don't take it personally. It's like, well, this is a thing that happened at work, and I'm going to go home and I'm going to hang out with my friends, or I'm going to bake something, and I'll try again tomorrow. And so I'm not saying that this is very easy to maintain this kind of compartmentalization, but it's just because the way I approach and the way I look at my work is I consider it I very explicitly consider it secondary to my life. That these ups and downs are sort of muted for me. It's like, well, I got a paper accepted, and that's very cool. But now I'm going to go home because I need to stop working today for my own mental health. Or, I get a paper rejected. That's great. I'm going to go hang out with friends because I'm a little bit annoyed now because the reviewers don't know what they're talking about, obviously. So, I think it's important to remember that this is not all of the world. And in many ways, we live in, academia is such a minor fraction of what's going on in the world that it's very easy because we're here to get caught up in it, but it's not the most important thing in your life.
And to add on to that, you can in some sense compartmentalize and say, I'm done with work on this day. And also, I want to say from personal experience, you can also not be in academia anymore. Which is exactly what I chose to do. So I didn't finish my PhD program, and I think it's important to say that because I'm here giving advice for people who are intending to do a PhD. And I'm not telling you not to do a PhD, but I'm also telling you that it's okay to not continue doing a PhD if it's not the right thing for your life. And it wasn't the right thing for my life to keep doing a PhD. As much as I really, really loved a lot of the research that I was doing, and I absolutely loved the people that I was working with, it wasn't working out well for me. It wasn't good for my mental health, and it wasn't the right structure for me to be happy within. And when you get to a point like that, like, you have only one life to live, and you should live the life that it turns out is the right life for you to live. And in my case, I ended up still doing a lot of awesome, cool research, and that is exactly what I want to be doing. Like, I'm super happy doing what I am doing now. So I think sometimes people will sort of, even if they don't mean to, speak about the academic life as if it's this sort of one single arc, and that if you deviate from the arc, like maybe you needed to do that and maybe that's good, but you're not a part of the continuing story of academia. And I think that's not true. Like, you actually have a huge amount of choices about the ways that you can be in the world that allow you to continue to engage with this kind of material, like, and do the stuff you love. And I think that's, I don't know, good to keep in mind.
Cool. So maybe that's a good segue. A lot of great answers. Keep in mind that you can ask also questions on Slido, or if you have, but may I ask one more question, I'll get your question. So maybe it's a good segue to talking, several questions on Slido were about industrial experience. So can you comment a bit about, how do you think academic training may help or may not help in industry, and what are differences between industry and academia for those of you who are working in academia or have worked in labs before?
So I had 2 industry internships, one during undergrad and one during my PhD. And I think I can say that the most valuable thing that translates, that I got out of my PhD experience was learning to communicate. Throughout my undergrad, I had writing courses, and I managed to get A's in them and not learn how to write at all. And in my PhD training, I was required to learn how to write and required to learn how to communicate complex ideas well. And I think that was the most important thing I got out of it. And I really experienced that when I did an industry internship during my PhD. During my undergrad internship, I had some project I was required to write up instructions, and I was completely baffled by the whole project. And I went through many iterations on this document I was writing, and I really couldn't do it. But by the time I did, I was, I think, 2 or 3 years into my PhD when I went and did an internship at Cisco, and we were doing some very cool work, and I was not only was I not intimidated by the prospect of trying to write and describe this work, I had weekly meetings in which I would describe what we were doing, and I was pushing very hard to say, I want to write a paper about this work, and I just starting to write and try to explain it. And that was very valuable, just being able to communicate these complex ideas to other industry people, and to be able to sort of push forward and say, like, I want to write and I want to document and explain this idea really well. And so I think, there are some things that would not help me in industry. Like, I can do complex proofs, and I don't think almost anybody in industry would care. But that ability to write and communicate and speak, practice giving talks, those are very valuable skills that you will get in a PhD, and they will be translated into skills in pretty much any area.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone loves good documentation. Fewer people know how to write good documentation. And I think a lot of the writing tips that we saw earlier are excellent ways of structuring technical documentation, even if it is not to a program committee. So I think that's one of the really nice things about working at Galois specifically, is that most of my coworkers have a lot of experience writing really good academic papers, because a lot of my coworkers have been in academia in some capacity before, and those who haven't also tend to be pretty good technical writers as well. But it is, yeah, just to second that, it is really an amazingly good thing to hone. Yeah, I don't think I have many other things to add to that pop into my head right now.
Yeah, I completely agree with them on how much I've learned in communication during my PhD, but I will not add anything else about that. I'll just say a few words on the differences between industry and academia. So I think that one of the big differences, it's the priorities. I think that when we are in academia, we are doing research, and something that I often felt was that the biggest priority was to have a good paper in 1 or 2 years' time, or there's always the motivation is always chasing a deadline, and that did not work very well for me. But that's how I often felt. Yes, the quality of the work is very important, but then there was always this pressure to submit papers. While in industry, again, quality of the work is important, and if you do manage to write a paper in the end, that's great, but that's not a priority. So that's one of the differences. And the other one, it's maybe the dimension of the work. So for example, when I was a PhD student, I had this project that I used to call it's my baby, because it was my project, it was my decisions, and it was much smaller than the kind of work that we do in industry. So in industry, you are working with a team, so you don't work alone that much. You need to be in constant communication and collaboration with your teammates. The work that you do might be used by more people. That's usually what happens. It's a bit pessimistic, sorry. But yeah, so I would say that these are the two main differences I've seen so far. But having said that, I'm working in a research lab, so I'm still doing research. I'm not sure how much different this would be in a production team.
Okay.
I have maybe a little bit more to say about that. So I guess I'm not working on a production team, but I will say that a lot of the structure of deadlines and, like you were saying, collaboration within a more industry-like setting, although like Gala is odd and not representative, has been incredibly helpful for me in terms of finding a better work-life balance and being able to know what I'm doing and where I'm headed. It's really awesome to have all of these structures of like this is the way the project is oriented. We have these goals that we want to reach at these times. Like when you state it like this, it sounds like you're stating all of these constraints, and that must be impinging on your freedom. But I think those of us who are proponents of type systems know that sometimes when you constrain the things that a person can do, it's a lot easier to express the things that you want to express. And I think that's also true within the context of time management. Within a constrained environment where you have to be a little bit more accountable about your time, at least I've found it's a lot easier for me to distinguish between what time is work and what time is not work. For me, that's been radically life-changing.
Okay. There's no other. Are there any other answers? Okay, so I want to take audience questions. Do one question.
Thank you for all of your comments. I just want to address something that Professor Bowman was saying about, so this is something I have heard about from some of my peers, very successful peers in fact, about the sort of not being too emotionally involved with the outcomes of what you do and the fact that it's just a job at the end of the day and then your own well-being is important. It's, at least for me, being my own man and all that is a thing, but it's very easy for me to get caught up in like peer pressure and it's very difficult for me to not view little mistakes that I may or may not make as predicating big consequences in the future. How does one consciously work against that kind of...
Yeah, so just to make sure I understand, the question is essentially, it's all well and good to say it's easy to not be emotionally invested in your work, but there are lots of pressures to be emotionally invested in your work. And so how do you sort of fight against that? That's a good question, and I'm not sure I have any particularly good advice. So sometimes it is an active process. So if you follow me on Twitter, which I know some of you do because you keep coming up to me and telling me, at the beginning of this semester, I was struggling to not be too emotionally involved. So this semester is a bit intense for me. I've overscheduled myself a bit. So I'm teaching 2 classes, and I have research, and I have things to review and grad student applications to look at. But I was on my break. I was on my winter break, and I was on vacation, and I was not going to work. But there was a small part of me in the back of my mind saying, maybe I should get started on my lecture notes because there's going to be a lot of work this semester. And, oh, maybe I should get started writing that assignment because there's going to be a lot of work this semester. But I sort of recognized this little voice in the back of my head, and I told myself, no, I'm not going to work. I'm on vacation. And I did that because I know that I need to do that. I need to draw a hard line for myself and say that I'm going to ignore this little anxious voice in the back of my mind, and in the long run, that will be better for me. And so part of it is sort of recognizing when there are these external pressures or even internal pressures that are telling you to do things that you know you shouldn't do. And it's hard to know what that line is, know what the line of when should you listen to that voice? Like, if you've got a popple talk in a day, maybe you should listen to that voice. But if you're on vacation and you think, well, I mean, I've got a whole semester to write assignments and lecture notes, that can wait a day. That can wait until the start of the semester. Maybe you shouldn't listen. When you have external pressures, so you have colleagues who are, or you have advisors, or you have mentors who are telling you maybe you should be putting more work in. It's even harder because these are people that you may respect, and these are people who are more senior and they have experience. And part of you thinks maybe you should listen to them. So if you have people telling you, oh, you need to be working much harder than this because, back in my day, I was working 80 hours a week and supporting 2 children and driving uphill both ways through the snow in order to finish my PhD. Maybe don't listen to them. On the other hand, if it's your advisor and they have good rationale and they're being encouraging, maybe you should be putting more work in. And if you feel like you can't, maybe you should have a conversation and figure out what it is that's not letting you get enough work done or causing that concern and causing that tension. So I'm not sure I have particularly good advice. It's something, when I say I compartmentalize, I don't say I do it easily. I do it consciously, and sometimes it's easier than other times.
Thank you.
I think also those pressures can be a lot softer and subtler than someone saying, you ought to be doing more work because I was doing more work and that was hard. I think it can be as subtle as I go on Twitter and I follow a number of people on Twitter who do PL, and they post things like, hey, check out this new paper that I published about XYZ awesome cool thing. Or, selfie of me in the basement at 2 a.m. doing cool stuff. And I remember as a grad student, there are certain grad student Twitter celebrities. And this is a thing. And you measure yourself by looking at the way that other people look. And not just on Twitter, but also in real life. And I think it's important to recognize that these people are also people just like you, and most likely you're seeing their successes and not their failures, and you're seeing a projection of what you imagine the rest of their life is like from the pieces of them that you do see. And I know that for me, I tend to project that other people are a lot more hardworking and awesome and successful and productive than I am whenever I see any evidence of that whatsoever. So it's easy to do.
I just wanted to say that one thing I and other grad students I know have found useful is that in managing kind of the ups and downs of grad school is having something else in your life, some other activity you do, probably non-academic, where you see visible progress. So what I mean by that is, for me, I guess it's pretty obviously sports. For friends, it's music, knitting, things that you do them and you run farther, you run faster, or you master a piece of music that you didn't before, you knit a scarf, where you see this progress in some area of your life when like sometimes for months at a time your work might be failing, or like cooking, like I bake all the time and stuff like that, because it kind of helps it helps kind of modulate those highs and lows and makes it a little easier to be like, okay, well, you know what, work's not been going well at all this week, but I made a really nice cake.
So one thing Kenny said earlier, I think was really good about sometimes putting constraints on yourself helps you express more of what you want. And one thing I found, because I'm the sort of person who gets too emotionally involved in my work, I found that putting distinct times, I'm going to come into work at this time and I'm going to stop at this time, and that's going to be enough time for me. And actually holding myself to that, because I can't just not listen to the little voice in my head that tells me not to work. But if I make a promise to myself beforehand that's specific, I start to be able to do that a lot better. And I know that trick has worked for several other grad students I know who found that helped them get through exactly this problem.
Okay, and yeah, I agree. Totally agree with the members, and it's important things is that you should make something that let you escape from research. So, for example, yeah, anything is okay. For example, it may be going out to somewhere, and it may be some hobbies. Yeah, but the important things is that escaping is not is very important things in a long period research life. So, yeah, so the first things I highly recommend that you find good things that you can forget research.
All right. If there's any other audience questions, otherwise I'll continue with Slido. There's some questions about kind of starting research projects. So I guess often when you're starting a research project, you're kind of working with many other people perhaps, or you may be not quite sure what's going on. So how do you make that transition from going from an existing project to kind of proposing and maybe leading a new project of your own?
Yeah, so I think maybe the first 2 or 3 years I didn't have any of my own research ideas. My advisor gave me a problem and I went and I worked on it. And occasionally I would have ideas to like, oh, this solution isn't quite working the way we want it to, so well, I'll tweak it. But it was mostly, I'd been given an idea, I'd been given a technique, and I maybe changed it a little bit. But after attending a ton of talks and doing a ton of reading, and you start to get your own ideas. You start to think, oh, all these people, they don't know what they're doing. And the first one of those I had, which I now have some evidence, was I'd been learning about dependent type systems, and I'd been learning how to use Coq and do formal proofs. And I had an idea that all of this is just macros. I come from a scheme background. I like parentheses and I like macros. And nobody believed me, and well, that was fine. So I went and tried to prove it. And I started, I had this idea I had in my head. This is a thing I want to be true. I think is true. And the question was, well, how do I prove it? And you talk to people. You start tinkering with the idea. You start trying to devise, well, what's an experiment that would convince people? You tell other people at conferences, oh, this is my idea. How do I prove it? And maybe you show them some evidence. They're like, I'm not convinced yet. Well, what would convince you? Or you start writing a paper and you get a bunch of reviews back that say, well, we're not convinced. So here's hopefully if you get good reviews, they'll say these are the things that might convince us, or here's where you should change your work. So you shouldn't expect instantly to have ideas, but you'll start getting them as you absorb more information. And once you have them, you talk to people about them and you try to convince other people of your ideas, and they will give you some direction or some ideas for how to move it forward. And the first person was probably your advisor. You should talk to them, but don't be shy about talking to anyone else who you might think would be interested.
Yeah, I think I agree with basically all of that. I guess I can share the brief version of the story of the first research idea that I had that felt like something that was my own. And the way it came out was I was working on trying to write some static analysis about strictness in Haskell. And we realized that it's actually quite hard, as a lot of people have realized before us, to analyze strictness statically. So we said, okay, well, maybe we can analyze it dynamically. Maybe we can test for strictness rather than checking it statically. And there's some work in doing that. But there was sort of this moment of being hit over the head with, I guess, how to describe this? A feeling of not having seen something before and looking through the things that people have done and not seeing anybody else doing it, and not being convinced that nobody else had done it because it felt like it was too simple. And I think I almost gave up because it felt like it was just really dumb, because, you know, if this thing feels really simple, so obviously someone's done this before, this is obvious, like, and I guess we didn't listen to that, and I was encouraged by a couple of other people not to listen to that feeling. So I think maybe it's good to not listen to the feeling that something that you figured out is too simple, because sometimes it turns out to not quite be too simple, and the other people just didn't think of the simple thing. So that felt kind of cool.
Yeah, so I think that as programming language researchers, we are very lucky, because so what we do is programming languages, right? We either create new languages or we try to solve problems in existing languages. So the best way of finding those problems, in my opinion, is to spend some time doing some programming. So just pick a domain, pick a language, find some open source projects, try to do some coding there, some contributions, and most times, for me at least, I always come up with an idea of, oh, this is something really cool that I could work on. And 90% of these ideas are completely rubbish. But that's what happens to me, at least. I spent a few months working on a project. I'm just doing some programming, nothing too researchy, and then I find a problem. And if there is a problem, maybe I can come up with some creative solution for that problem. And then once I have that idea, what I try to do is I try to go to experts in the field. I ask for advice. I ask whether they know if it has been done, whether they think I should do it. And so far I've always had good feedback about it, or sometimes even negative feedback is good feedback. So I've recently started working on my own idea, because as William was saying, for me as well, during my PhD, I was given a topic and then I just started from there. So it's different. And now for the first time, I feel like I'm working on my own ideas. So ask me 1 year or 2 years from now, and then I'll let you know how that went.
I just want to say that I had this notion that ideas and research were things that just like came from scratch, just out of nowhere. And I guess some of them are like that. And I certainly know researchers who just come up with something and it's great. But there are different kinds of ideas. And at least for myself, I found that my brain is good at putting things together from different kinds of places. Like, oh, a little bit of a technique that I saw here. Oh, and a problem that's similar but kind of different to something over here. I wonder if those two things would work together. And it's funny that I'm sitting right next to Andrew right now, because we're actually meeting to talk about a new project that kind of does something like that. So there are different ways to have different ideas, and one isn't necessarily like better or the right way of doing things.
Like Anna, I tend to put things together and go, I wonder if those can work together. So, this project that she was talking about comes from me looking at one system and going, that typing rule looks familiar. It's kind of like this logic rule in another system. I wonder if they're related. And just trying to push forward on that. Another way I've gotten ideas is having a colleague talk to me about something they're doing and going, well, what about this aspect of it, and pushing forward on it. So I had a colleague who came up and said, you know, I'm looking at extending the system this way. And I think maybe you might have some ideas here. And I looked at it and I said, so that's interesting, but what about this aspect? Can we push that? Can we, I don't understand why this thing works in your system. And he realized he didn't know why it worked either, so we ended up writing a paper together trying to explain why it worked. So
okay, and to find a new research idea, I'm lucky because my research career started with gradual typing, and gradual typing is a very flexible framework to integrate static typing and dynamic typing. But as you know, there are many static typing features. So we have many approaches, many fields to work in gradual typing. And if I'm not satisfactory with such a framework, then it's a chance to do the next research. And another approach is to combine some classical notions and new notions. For example, my recent work is on combining polymorphism with effect handlers. So effect handlers is a new mechanism to describe the user-defined effect. And of course, polymorphism is a very classical notion, but by combining the classical notions, polymorphism with new notions, effect handlers, we get a new result. So it is, I think, a promising approach.
Thanks a lot. We only have a few more minutes left in the panel. I wish we could have more time. But maybe one very, very quick question, since we are at the middle of a lot of conferences. One of the lead questions on Slido was if you could say a bit about what you get the most out of other people's talks at conferences and other venues.
So I was always taught to view a talk as an advertisement for a paper. And in a lot of ways, that's one of the top things I get. I look at this and what I expect to see and what I enjoy seeing is a cool, quick idea that makes me go, ooh, I wonder how that works, and gets me excited to go read the rest of the paper.
I just wanted to say, in case it hasn't already been said to y'all, but it's totally normal, fine, and expected to be super confused at many talks, and there are still definitely, I probably speak for all of us when I say there are still talks here where we're like, okay, I kind of understood the problem, and then I just got lost, and that's fine. I try to focus on first, like, what is the problem they're trying to solve, and like, why is it important, and maybe like one thing about how they're trying to approach it. And if I get that out of a talk, then I'm like, great, good, and then I can see if I want to read the paper for more details.
Yeah, same as both of them, but also I do something else. So something I've tried and I'm still trying to work on is on my presentation skills. Like when I give a talk, I'm trying to improve on that. And something that I've been doing for the past 3 or 4 years is even if I cannot follow the content of the talk, if I cannot understand it, I tried to judge the talk in terms of delivery. So these slides are awesome, this speaker is very good, and I can see that he's doing this, and that, and I can see that she did this, and that, and I try to judge what's good and what's wrong, and then I try to use those lessons for myself. It's something very small, but I think that I've been learning a lot from watching other people giving talks. So.
I would also say that there's a body of psychological research that shows that people have a finite resource of attention that you spend at various rates and it only replenishes at a certain rate. So if you find that you're burning your attention really, really fast and hard trying to understand a talk and it's not getting anywhere, it's okay to stop doing that because you want to replenish your attention to be able to pay attention to things that are more tractable for you. And this is something that I do a lot. And it helps me to find the talks that I'm able to really engage with. But then there will also be talks where you're like, man, this talk is really hard, but it's at like the periphery of my ability to grasp. So I'm going to like deliberately elect to like really like dig my teeth into it and like come along for the ride. And I think that's also valuable to do. But there's an ability to treat your attention as an object rather than just something that you're subject to that I think can be really powerful when you're navigating conferences. It's a resource like sleep that is important to view as something that you can look at rather than something that's just happening to you and you don't have control over it.
Yeah, in short, the thing that I get out of talks and out of conferences is randomness. I will usually go through the program and figure out, oh, these talks might be interesting. And I'm almost always wrong about what I'll get out of the talk. But I will get something out of the talk. And I'll just give one example from this conference. I was going to this talk on multi-stage programming, multi-stage metaprogramming, which is something I'm very interested in. And what I got out of the talk was something about dependent types and compilation that had nothing to do with anything in the talk. It was just that there was something on some random slide that triggered some thought somewhere in my head that sent my mind wandering down a new path. And this happens pretty frequently. So I don't really try to have high expectations or have many expectations at all when I walk into a talk. I will just try to walk into a talk and I'm fairly sure that I will get something kind of unexpected and random out of the encounter. And I make a note anytime one of this happens, and I judge a conference's relative success based on how many of these random events happened that triggered a new thought or a new idea in my mind.